Hello, today we're going to be working on changing the period length of the sine and the cosine graph. So we'll start with what we know about the sine and the cosine graph. First off, the sine graph, I'm going to do a little bit of drawing and then I'm going to undo it. Sine graph starts at 0, goes up at, not quite that far, up at pi over 2, down, back to the midline at pi, down and then back to the midline. So that's our sine graph. And it takes 2 pi to complete one cycle, which means after this it's going to start repeating the same thing. And in front of that, same thing. So I'm going to undo all that. The cosine graph, it starts above the midline, goes to midline at 2 pi, below the midline at pi, back to the midline and up. That's our basic cosine graph. It also has has a period length of 2 pi. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at what it takes to squish something, that didn't work, to squish something horizontally or stretch it horizontally, which we haven't done yet with any of our other parent graphs. So what we want to think about is our circle of terror, back to that little amusement park ride where somebody got on here, went around, and for the sine graph we were measuring the altitude and came back around here. For the cosine graph we were measuring the distance from the center line. So we have our A, H, and point to the right things, A, H, and K. So if we think about a difference here, the radius of the circle of terror was 4 kilometers instead of 1 kilometer. Then this distance right here, instead of being 1, would be 4, which means if we haven't gone anywhere, our altitude is 0, but we are 4 away from the center line for our cosine graph. So instead of being here, we'd be way up at 4. So that would change our A value. That would change our altitude. If you board it at the lowest point, so instead of boarding here, you board here, which is at 3 pi over 2, or you can also think of that as negative pi over 2. So if this is pi over 2 and this is 0, and I ignore this circle for a minute, and this is negative pi over 2, I'm starting my sine graph back here instead. So that's going to change. That's going to basically give me a horizontal shift. So if I think about it as boarding here at 3 pi over 2, I wouldn't start my graph until right here. So that's my H value. And then if the whole thing is 2 kilometers above the ground, it's moving the entire thing up, and that's my K value. So if all 3 of those were true, I'd have y equals 4 for my altitude, sine x minus 3 pi over 2 plus 2. The x minus 3 pi over 2 could also be x plus pi over 2, depending on whether I think of it as a negative pi over 2 or a positive 3 pi over 2. All right, so that's how those different pieces affect it. So period length, that is defined by 1 full cycle. In our sine graph here we got 1 full cycle, then it repeats that same full cycle, and it's just going to continue and continue. Same thing with the cosine graph. We have, wrong function, 1 full cycle, and it does the same thing, down and up, and it's just going to go down and up and down and up, so on and so forth. So that's my 1 full cycle. So we can think about this in terms of the circle of terror thing. We can think about it in terms of being a time thing. How much, if it takes 2 pi minutes to go around that circle, that's going fairly fast. But if we want to change that amount of time, that's one way to think about it in terms of that reference to the circle of terror. So if I want to complete 2 cycles within 2 pi. I have this new setup. Oh, no, I skipped over it. We're adding into the y equals sine x. We're adding in a b value. And b value changes how many cycles I want to complete within 2 pi. So if I want to complete 2 cycles within 2 pi, b would be 2. If I want to move the graph to the left, pi over 2. Remember, if I want to move left, I add. So my h would be negative pi over 2, because then it would be x minus the negative pi over 2, so x plus pi over 2. So one of the things that people struggle with is where to put that 2. Do they put it inside the parentheses with x and h, or do they, that would be outside, I should point to the right thing, outside the parentheses with x and h, or inside the parentheses? So one of the things we can do is we can take a look at Desmos and see how this works. Probably going to refresh there. Yep, still working. Okay, so we can go sine 2, put another parentheses, and then x, see if I can go just a little slower with this, and then pi divided by 2. Arrow over, close the parentheses, close the parentheses. All right, so that is the 2 outside of the parentheses. And what we wanted, actually, when we go into this, let's change our settings to be pi over 4. There we go. All right, so we wanted our graph to start pi over 2 to the left, so right here, and we wanted it to complete 2 cycles within 2 pi. So let's get rid of that for the moment. So one thing to think about is where is the end of 2 pi? So if I have pi over 2, this and positive pi over 2, this is 1 cycle within 1 pi, and then another cycle within 2 pi. So I have my beginning and my end of 1 cycle and my end of a 2nd cycle. So that full space is 2 pi, and I completed 2 cycles within that. So that accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. If I put the, sorry, messing with my functions here. If I put, let's get rid of those, the 2 inside of the parentheses, then something different happens. So I end up not starting at pi over 2, but starting at negative pi over 4. And the reasons for that can have to do with that 2 not being fully factored out. So I need to make sure whenever I write my b value, it's outside of the parentheses with x minus h. So I'm not going to mess with the other one. I'll shrink that down. Let you guys do that on your own if you want to. But what I want to look at is how do I graph this, not make a mess. I don't want to go above 1 and negative 1, so I make my axes 1 and negative 1 for the y values. This moved over pi over 2 to the left, so I need to go into the negatives, so negative pi over 2, pi over 2, pi 2, sorry, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So remember that my original sine graph, I went like that. That was the original. This one, I want it to start here. And by the time I get to 2 pi, within 2 pi, so 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2. So this is going to be my end. So my halfway point, where I want to finish 1 cycle, is going to be at pi over 2. So that means I need to go up, middle, down, and middle. by then, which means I'm going to get another cycle with the up midline, down midline by 2 pi. So the equation in the correct form has the b outside of the parentheses. That's the one you want to make sure that you have in your notes. Definitely do not write that one. Okay. So let's talk about how we figure out what this is. Hang on just a second. I didn't really have to tell you to hang on a second. I just paused it so I could go let the dog out. Okay, so in each of these equations, our b value sitting out front, so we have 1/2, 4, and 1/2. That directly tells us the number of cycles within 2 pi. So if I'm going to get a half a cycle done within 2 pi, then how many does it take me to do a full cycle? So if I think about like half of the cycle for sine, let's say I have 0 and I have 2 pi here, then that's my halfway point. I have to have 4 pi to get a full cycle. If I'm going to fit 4 cycles within 2 pi, so I've got 0 and 2 pi, and I'm just looking at period length here, and I need to do this little thing 4 times. Half of that I would need to do 2, so there's pi, and half of that, 1/2 pi, that's going to split it into 4, so I got to do that cycle within pi over 2. So my period length is pi over 2. If my cycle is 1/4, or sorry, b is my 1/4, then I finish 1/4 of a cycle within 2 pi, which means it's going to take 4 times 2 pi to get a full cycle. So that's going to be 8 pi. One way to look at that is to take the 2 pi and divide it by the b value to get your period length. Again, something you may want to write down particularly. This is going to be the kind of highly proficient version of the transformations with that period change in there. So if you're going for that, make sure you get that written down. All right, so now to sketch those. Really, these are all going to look pretty similar to each other. What you need to change is your axis, or your axes. So none of these have a change in A, so I'm going to go ahead and make this one and this -1, just so I give myself a little more space. Whoops. So the first one is 1/2 pi, so my period length, remember with 1/2 pi, so 2 pi divided by 1/2 is going to give me 4 pi. So my period length is 4 pi. So what that means is instead of making this 2 pi, I'm going to make it 4 pi. So I'm going to go by pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. So my scale, I'm just going to go by pi. So this is a sine graph, so I'm going to start at the midline, up to 1, back to the midline, down to 1, back to the midline. So that's my sine graph. If I looked at that on Desmos, that would be much more stretched out, so it'd be much more like something like that. But I don't want to take the space to that, so I'm just doing the change in the x-axis. The cosine is, cosine 4x. My period length then is going to be much smaller, so 2 pi divided by 4 is 1/2 pi. So this is, I'm just going to make that 1/2 pi. So that's going to be pi over 4. Split that in half to be pi over 8. So this would be 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8. So my scale is going to be pi over 8. and the period length is going to be pi over 2. So cosine starts off of the midline, so I'm going to start up to midline, down, midline, up. This is why the scale on your axes is so important, and when you are taking the test on this, it is absolutely vital every single graph you do that you make sure you scale your x and your y axes. All right, cosine 1/4, 2 pi divided by 1/4, 8 pi. So that means my finishing point I want to be 8 pi. Half of that is 4 pi, half of that is 2 pi. So my scale then is 2 pi. Period length, period length is going to be 8 pi. So this is cosine again. I'm going to start up, midline, down, midline, up. Again, if I were to do this on Desmos, I'd be looking at a really big stretch. So, but it's all about that scale and knowing how to figure that out. But if you're wondering, you may also want to just check them on Desmos and see how you're doing with them. Okay, so now we have several different things involved here, and we need to figure out what our scale is going to be. So let's first look. We've got a midline of 1 and an amplitude of 3. So that means I'm going to start at 1 and I'm going to go as high as 4 and as low as -2. So I don't really need to worry about my scale on the y-axis. I can just make that 1s. Add 1 line there. My scale on the x-axis, though, I'm going to take that 4, figure out my period length. So 2 pi over 4 is going to be 1/2 pi. So to finish that period length, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make 1/2 pi. I also have to move it over pi over 4. So I'm going to change my x scale. So if we think about what we did in the previous exercise, when we had a period length of pi over 2, we made our scale pi over 8. So if we make this pi over 8, pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, pi over 2, and, sorry, doing math in my head, 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, 5 pi over 8. That's where I am. Then I have a scale to go on. So I would definitely use the guidelines that we used on the last little exercise in terms of figuring out what you want your scale to be. So I'm going to use some different colors here. I want my horizontal starting place to be at pi over 4. And this was x minus pi over 4, so I'm moving it right. And I want my midline at 1. I don't know what I just did there. Midline at 1. And I need to finish within pi over 2. So I'm going to start at the midline. It's going to be my first point. My altitude, remember, is 3, so I need to go up 3. Back to my midline, down 3 from my midline, and then back to my midline, which means I am finishing this at 3 pi over 4. And you can check your beginning and your end point to make sure that you have done this correctly by doing 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 4. Those were your horizontal starting places. So 3 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 which gives you 2 pi over 4, which is the equivalent of pi over 4. No, sorry, pi over 2. Threw myself off there for a second. So, and that's what we wanted our period length to be. Okay, so the next one, give us a little bit more space there. Once again, so I got my midline, that's my K. So I got a midline at -2. I have to go up and down 2 from there for my A value. So I'm going to leave my Y scale again at 1. Just to add that -4 down there. I'm going to end up moving this over 2 pi. That's my H value, and that's going to be left 2 pi. So my B value is 1/4. So if we have 1/4, we take 2 pi divided by 1/4. That is going to be 8 pi. So we need our scale to be 2 pi so that we can get those 5 points in there. So if we go, and the way I'm thinking about that is I'm splitting this into, yes, I have 5 lines there, but I've got, this is my brain, not how you have to think about it, but I've got 4 sections there. So I take that 8 pi and I section it into those 4 sections. So 8 pi divided by 4 is going to give me 2 pi. So I'm going to use 2 pi for my scale. So each of those lines is going to represent 2 pi. So 2 pi, 4 pi, 6 pi, 8 pi, 10 pi, -2 pi, -4 pi. All right, so let's get all this stuff in there. So if I have my midline, actually we did the horizontal starting place first last time, so let's do that again. I'm going to move this left 2 pi, so I'm going to have my horizontal start there. I'm going to take my midline of -2, I'll put that in. And this should complete within 8 pi. Pardon me. Something important to remember, this is a cosine graph, so it's not going to start at your new origin, as I like to call it here. It's going to start 2 above that. So there's your midline, you're going to start 2 up from that. So your first point is going to be right here, back to the midline, down 2, back to the midline, and up 2. So that's my cosine. And this would continue on in both directions. But we just want to do that one so we can clearly see what the start and the end to it is. So if I've got my end minus my start, that's 6 pi minus a -2 pi gives us 8 pi, which is how much it took to complete one period. So that's our graph on that one. This definitely creates some more challenges, particularly with figuring out what that scale needs to be. So if you are wanting highly proficient on this particular skill, make sure you take some time and practice that, because it does definitely take some getting used to. So that's all I have for you. So have a lovely day.